This program was developed to commemorate three major anniversaries within 2 years, 2007 to 2009. The program celebrates our rich history and is also designed to help orient newcomers to Unitarian Universalism. If you are familiar with the work of Ken Burns, the famous video documentarian with many programs that have aired on PBS, such as the comprehensive documentary about the Civil War, and most recently about World War II, you already have an appreciation for history. This quote reminds us of the importance of knowing our heritage and from where we've come. Our current church can trace its history back to the beginnings of two distinct churches, the Universalist, which organized in May of 1859. The 150th anniversary was celebrated in 2009. A new written history was unveiled at that time, covering the years since 1982. The Unitarian Church was organized in October of 1907. These two institutions voted to merge on June 2nd of 1957. The merger became official on October 13th of 1957, with the 50th anniversary celebrated in 2007. Both churches had started university student groups. Those merged locally in 1954 to form the Channing Murray Foundation. The book shown on the left was written to commemorate the 25th anniversary of merger, the years from 1957 to 1982. A committee, headed by Doris Jones, completed another book that covers the years since 1982. Two earlier histories of both churches were written respectively by Carl Bays and Ethel Forbes Scott, the daughter of the founders of the Unitarian Church. Both of these documents provided a lot of information for the program that you are listening to today. You'll see Ethel Forbes Scott's name on the upright Steinway piano and in other places around the church. The University of Illinois, founded in 1868, took in its first students in the early 1870s, with fewer than 1,000 enrolled until the late 1890s. At the turn of the century, U of I enrollment increased rapidly. With the bullet-pointed slides, I will highlight some of the major developments. So, regarding Universalism, the beliefs that existed for hundreds of years didn't really become a movement till the 1700s. English Universalists had come to America to escape persecution in the late 1700s, and it became quickly popular due to its loving and inclusive doctrine. Its main belief was not heaven or hell, but in universal salvation, thus the term Universalist. It officially formed in America in 1793. The early developers you can read on the slide, but names that we are very familiar with, probably more familiar with John Murray and Hosea Ballou. In 1863, it was the first in the U.S. to ordain women with full denominational authority. The Civil War, however, destroyed many Universalist churches. As time went on, by other congregations and other denominations, there was less focus on damnation, so it made Universalism less unique. And so the Universalists struggled as membership waned. The theology became more closely aligned with the Unitarian beliefs, and the two merged nationally in 1961. But the local churches were ahead of the curve and merged prior in 1957. So even though they formed in 1859, mostly because of the Civil War and other factors, it took them a while to actually purchase land and erect their first building. They bought a lot at the corner of Birch and Green for $450, and they built upon it. In 1870-71, the brick building went up. As seen in this slide, the two pictures are just slightly different views, one right after construction and the other one, who knows, maybe 10, 15 years later. It was considered the largest and most beautiful church in the community. Its cost of $15,000 was completely paid for by money raised at the dedication, attended by 500 people, 200 inside and 300 on the lawn, listening through the windows. Considering the population in Champaign-Urbana at that time, the proportion of liberal religious folks must have been a lot higher back then. But the prosperity didn't last. As stated in the last slide, most American Universalist churches struggled mightily during that time frame. For us, it was the first 3 decades, and a number of ministers were called for only short periods. In 1890, only 29 families contributed, and 18 families that attended regularly. With the appointment of the first woman minister, Edna McDonald, in 1898, the church turned a corner. She was one of only a few women ministers in the United States. During the 6-year ministry of Ezekiel Stevens, church finances had improved, so the Board of Trustees decided to rebuild the church. At that point, the brick structure was taken down to the brick foundation and was expanded somewhat to the current footprint of the current stone church that houses our main sanctuary. The cornerstone of the early brick church can still be seen in the northwest corner of the basement. In the almost 100 years before the 1957 merger, the Universalists were served by 29 ministers. In spite of innumerable difficulties brought about by the 3 financial depressions, droughts, the Civil War, and 2 world wars, they managed to survive. So it always seemed odd to me that after just 42 years, they decided they needed to tear down the original brick structure and replace it with a stone building. Now, I don't know, because of the friendly competition between the Unitarians and the Universalists, whether they were influenced at all by the fact that in 1907, the Unitarians had built a very handsome stone church on campus. Who knows? But supposedly it was to increase their space, and supposedly the brick structure had fallen into disrepair. Again, a little hard to believe after just 42 years. But it used the same brick foundation. The front corners were filled in. Notice the stairwell at the south entrance toward Green Street, so that the front vestibule area matches the smaller area between the brick walls at the front of the children's chapel room in the basement of the 1914 building. The bell tower and the rear of the sanctuary was also added. So if you're interested in a little bit more information, these portions were actually taken from the earlier histories of the Universalist Church. On January 15th of 1913, the board of the church met to discuss the need to extensively repair or rebuild their building, built at the corner of Green and Birch in 1871. The Reverend E.V. Stevens reported that the church was in excellent condition in every way but for its building and equipment. A building committee was elected, and an additional $15,000 was soon raised through private pledges. 2 designs were submitted for the church's sanctuary. Charles Morgan, architect and a prominent member of the church, submitted a bungalow-style design with all the rooms on one floor. Architect Joseph W. Royer, a renowned local architect, proposed a design that preserved the church's original foundation while expanding the sanctuary to the south, adding a new facade and bell tower. Royer and his firm, Royer and Davis, was ultimately chosen. The church was built in the English Gothic Revival style, with rough-dressed, irregularly coursed white limestone blocks and a steeply pitched slate roof. Heavy exterior buttresses supported the corners and nave walls. A flight of stone steps led to a new main entrance located at the base of the crenellated bell tower added along Birch Street. Narrow stained glass windows featuring a grape and vine motif illuminated the beamed interior. This motif was repeated in the large rose window that dominated the north wall of the sanctuary. The nave was extended to the south, with a multi-purpose room above that we now know as the Rood Loft. Construction started on the new building in September of 1913. Church services and Sunday school classes were temporarily relocated to Carpenter's Hall on South Race Street. On Sunday, November 29, 1913, a large crowd gathered at the nearby First Presbyterian Church to hear addresses by prominent visiting ministers. On the following day, November 30th, a grand procession of over 1,000 members of the Illinois Grand Lodge of Knights of Pythias marched from their hall on West Main Street in Urbana to the church site to help lay the new cornerstone. Congressman Lawrence V. Stringer addressed the large crowd. During the next year, construction progressed rapidly, and on September 17th and 20th of 1914, congregants attended services to dedicate the new Universalist church building. In 1964, a new religious education wing was added on the east side of the church to accommodate an increase in membership following the 1957 merger. The lower right picture shows the east side of the 1914 building prior to the addition. Some of the bullet points on this slide were actually already mentioned in previous slides, so I won't re-highlight those. But in 1900, the local Murray Club originated under the guidance of the Universalist minister, Reverend Miss Edna MacDonald. She served the church from 1898 until 1902. And the Murray Club was a group of university men and women. They played a vital role in the activities of the church. On the national level, Universalist young people, including those up to age 35, were organized into the Young People's Christian Union. Affiliated with YPCU, the local Murray Club members furnished most of the music for the church, both vocal and instrumental, and part of the janitorial work. They engaged in fundraising efforts, such as selling ice cream at the county fair, and staged dramatic and musical events, including an operetta. In 1904, they paid for a piano for the church. The Murray Club must have been a lively group. The minutes of the Board of Trustees meeting of November 12, 1901, noted a discussion of the uses of the church building and a decision that no dancing or improper conduct or amusement be allowed in the church. However, a few years later, the church called as its minister the Reverend George Salin, who was not only a preacher, but also a playwright and composer. He believed that the church was concerned with and should inquire into all areas of life, and admonished the congregation that rational and innocent amusement have an abiding place in the lives of all, young and old, and there should be no clash between ideals of ethics and healthy pleasure. Because the organ controversy is something still discussed today as part of church lore, and there will be more information about that a bit later, what was the original organ like for the Universalist side? It was an electric Wicks pipe organ, pictured here, recommended by the Music Committee and installed in 1924. The console faced the sanctuary. You can see the keyboard on the right. As an electric organ, it was not as fine an instrument as the Kilgan pipe organ at the Unitarian church that was mechanical in nature. The electric Wicks organ eventually died. You can see in this photo how it nearly fills the space at the front of the sanctuary. So some additional bullet points about the Universalist history. The Great Depression in 1929 led to a difficult time for all churches. Reverend Cranmer of a 7-year tenure left when they couldn't pay his salary. 5 articles of faith were dropped in 1932 as they were seen to be akin to a set creed, assuring that a free pulpit prevailed. The 1940s, we had Reverends Thayer, Pierce, and Engel. In the mid to late 40s, the Universalists lost many old-time members. The Unitarian Church, however, a few blocks away, was having a strong resurgence after World War II and the beginning of the baby boom. The final minister in the pulpit at the time of merger was Reverend Earl McKinney. He was called in 1954. He brought a dynamic liberalism and laid the groundwork for the merger with the Unitarians. the University of Illinois grew, it attracted scholars from the East, where Unitarianism was centered. It was inevitable that a Unitarian church should spring up near the campus. Many of the early faculty were New Englanders, where Unitarianism was more widely espoused. In 1888, a series of bi-monthly Unitarian services was begun and met in a variety of locations and at times was abandoned. The period of 1890 to 1906 is not covered in historical accounts, but it is thought that the original group maintained contact with the AUA in Boston. In the formative years, the Urbana Church was basically a missionary effort on the part of the American Unitarian Association. Monetary aid and the appointment of a minister came from Boston. They paid the minister's salary and also paid $5,000 toward a lot and a building modeled after a church in Kansas City. On September 23, 1906, Reverend Albert Ross Vail began the ministry of the Unitarian Church of Urbana. The new society was seen as a university church, counting 36 faculty among its regular attendees. It was felt that a more strategic center for the spreading of liberal Christianity could not be found in the Midwest. The first Urbana Unitarian Church building on the UI campus was dedicated in 1908. 4 years after organizing, the student group raised a majority of the funds for the Kilgan pipe organ, which was installed there and was later moved to the Green and Birch site in the late 1980s. In 1906, Reverend Albert Vail was considered an up-and-coming leader and began his ministry in Urbana. The first service was attended by 45, and the gathering gradually increased to 140 persons. About half the attendees were students. A young people's club was formed, made up of about 1% of the UI students. The Women's Alliance was also formed. A missionary zeal prevailed. It was felt that a large number of students would be shaken in their childhood beliefs by scientific study and would have no place to turn for a new religion. Here was the opportunity to satisfy their religious yearnings. Rabindranath Tagore was a famous East Indian poet and philosopher. He sent his son and another student to the U of I in the early teens. He came to the U.S. and lectured at the church in 1912. In 1913, he was the first non-European to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. He came again in 1916 to lecture at the church. In 1989, a festival bearing his name began and meets every year at Channing Murray. Reverend Albert Vail resigned in 1918. The congregants had become discontent with the Baha'i tenets that he had preached. A number of families left with him to form the local Baha'i group. Remaining members were determined to carry on, but they were without a minister until 1920 due to World War I. The next ministers were Hubert Carter, Edward Johnson, John Brogden, and, like the Universalists, they had periods of growth and decline based on their various ministries. One minister of note, Philip Shug, from 1943 to 1947. He fought for equal rights for returning black soldiers, and he extended to a community-wide effort to get equal access to all services for black citizens: barbers, theaters, restaurants, swimming pools, and student housing. Reverend Shug was a community activist before the term became popular. Much loved, both he and his wife Mary were young and full of energy. Openly humanist, he did alienate some in the congregation. Shug assisted Vashti McCollum in her national suit against religious instruction in schools. She wins the case in 1948 with a Supreme Court decision in McCollum versus Board of Education of Champaign Schools. If you know Dan McCollum, a former Champaign mayor, Vashti was his mother. By the time he left the church, had activities going every day of the week. By 1948, The method of selecting a minister had become much more formalized by the American Unitarian Association. Arnold Westwood was invited by a unanimous vote. He served the church for 9 years, which turned out to be a tremendously exciting time on the U of I campus. The post-war surge of students became a flood in 1947 that continued into the 1950s. The increase in the number of faculty was equally impressive, and all campus facilities were taxed. More space was desperately needed in the church school to accommodate the post-war baby boom. With considerable difficulty, excavation under the Unitarian Church building to create a basement eventually provided a new kitchen, nursery room, and a large gathering hall. A number of the most distinguished and controversial university faculty and administrators, including the president, were active members of the church. Church membership and programs expanded to fill all space. 2 worship services were held, as well as 2 sessions of the church school. In 1955 and 56, membership was close to 200, attendance about 180, church school enrollment was 150, and attendance over 100. The youthful Arnold Westwood could have been overwhelmed in this setting, but he concentrated on his strengths, and his warmth and sincerity spread over the community. During Westwood's pastorate, an amazing flowering of the church took place in all aspects, including the student club's successful series on contemporary arts and society. In 1954, the ministers Westwood and McKinney from the Universalist Church were responsible for the merger of the 2 separate university groups. This successful establishment of the Channing-Murray Foundation forecast the merger of the 2 churches. Each of the ministers reported spending about 1/3 of their time on Channing-Murray activities. Expansion of the physical facilities was actually long overdue. In April 1949, excavation of space under the church was started with Seichi Konzo, who went by Bud, as chairman of the building committee. He had been active in the student club in the 1920s and had designed and installed a new heating system in 1939. The building was supported on jacks while the soil was dug out, first by manpower and then, when there was room enough, by horses pulling a scoop. The sloped window wells along the south wall of the chapel remained, where dirt was dragged out from under the building. One of the supporting jacks shifted, the southwest corner of the building sagged slightly, and has remained that way ever since. A new kitchen, nursery room, and fellowship hall came into being under the 40-year-old structure. In December of '49, a dedication celebration was held, and the hall was named Emerson Hall after Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1967, it became the Red Herring Coffee House. This slide just shows pictures of some of the newly expanded space, much needed due to the baby boom. In 1954, the ministers Westwood and McKinney were responsible for the merger of the 2 separate university groups. This successful establishment of the Channing-Murray Foundation forecast the merger of the 2 churches. Each of the ministers reported spending about 1/3 of their time on Channing-Murray activities. They worked just as ably to manage the eventual merger of the 2 parish churches. Although merger had been discussed many times during a period of 4 decades, it wasn't consummated until McKinney and Westwood, 2 friends and former classmates from Tufts College, saw it through to actuality. The left side of the slide highlights the conditions at the Unitarian Church at the time of merger. It was growing vigorously following World War II and with the advent of the baby boom. The Unitarian Church was also landlocked by the U of I, necessitating having the basement dug out to create more space for all the little kiddies that were a part of the baby boom. Membership came mostly from university circles. On the Universalist side, on the right, there was a rift between the traditionalists versus progressives, and they lost members as a result. The Universalists were struggling. They had mortgaged their property, and the Universalists had more expansion space for an addition. Both churches were now using materials from the Beacon Press. Both had moved away from traditional Christian dogma, and a merger commission was established. Although not an easy decision, after a great deal of hard work and well-considered judgments by the merger commission, both congregations approved the recommendations to merge. The Universalist church vote was unanimous. The Unitarian vote was just over the required two-thirds majority. As part of the agreement, the two ministers were to continue during the early period as co-ministers of the United Church on the principle that, as far as possible, the duties and remunerations would be equal. Committees to arrange details were set up, constitutions and bylaws were rewritten for submission to the two congregations, still technically separate. The actual merger became official on October 13th by the procedure of accepting all members of the unincorporated Unitarian Church into the incorporated, in 1887, First Universalist Church. The name was changed to the Universalist Unitarian Church of Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. The total membership of 266 for the United Church was almost identical to the sum of the two churches before merger. There was an understanding that after the period of co-ministry, both ministers would leave and a new minister chosen. The departure of the co-ministers was followed by a difficult year of searching for the first minister of the merged church. The Reverend David Harris Cole of the First Universalist Church of Chicago accepted a unanimous call and moved to Urbana in the fall of '59. He had also been a classmate of Earl McKinney and Arnold Westwood at Tufts and had 15 years distinguished ministry. The Unitarians looked forward to his coming because of his social activism record. The Universalists were delighted that the new minister had been from their ranks. Cole served the church and the community with the same dedication characterized by his ministry in Chicago. His dictum was that the essential ingredient in any plan is enthusiasm. The minister and choir did 2 services every Sunday, one at Green and one at Channing Murray. A considerable strain, but a successful venture since attendance at each service was over 100. He preached polished sermons and was in demand as a community leader and speaker in spite of the fact he didn't hesitate to express unpopular views. Among many community activities, he helped organize the local urban league and urged the members to make contributions to the larger community. He hoped for a growing awareness of the worldwide mission of the liberal church in our culture. Cole saw the biggest headache of those years as the decision over the 2 buildings. Eventually, the congregation settled on enlarging the Green Street Church and also keep the property at Oregon and Matthews for a student program. In July of 1963, Cole indicated he had accepted a call to Rockville, Maryland. The church was without a minister from that time until 1964. In April of '64, the Reverend Jack Taylor was called. Highly attuned to national issues, he brought to the pulpit a zealous concern for justice in human affairs and for intellectual honesty in religious matters. And here are some additional pictures from the 1950s and 60s that preceded our building project and highlight the extent of the baby boom years. These pictures were taken in the basement room of the Universalist Church site, which is now our children's chapel. You might note that in the bottom left picture, the woman standing in the right of the picture behind the kids is Carolyn McMahon, a much-loved member of our congregation who died recently, and also served as the first director of religious education after the merger of the 2 churches. And here are some more pictures from the time of Reverend Jack Taylor. In April of 1964, he was called. He was highly attuned to national issues, and he brought to the pulpit a zealous concern for justice in human affairs and for intellectual honesty in religious matters. He describes his ministry in these words: student power, black power, anti-war, anti-draft, and drug movements tore at the fabric of the UU Church. The church was expected to be an agent for change, a spokesman for morality, and a pillar of stability, all at the same time. No social issue could be ignored from the pulpit, and no issue was ignored. A variety of options were explored for expansion of the newly merged church. One included trading the property at Oregon and Matthews with the university for other property. One plan was to build an all-new facility on Lincoln Avenue near California, or building an addition to the church on Green Street. After many possible configurations were explored, and doing the financial forecast, it was decided to add on at the Green Street location, to purchase additional properties located to the east of the building, and to keep the Oregon and Matthews property for the student program. Some rough years were ahead for the Channing-Murray property, too lengthy to detail here, but some fascinating accounts appear in the Channing-Murray history written by Jane Anderson. During this same period, the Green Street property underwent major changes. The old parsonage, which had been directly east of the stone church building, had been used for religious education classes prior to the addition. The pic on the left shows the two houses immediately east of the church. In the upper right picture, you see the parsonage being moved away to its new home on Philo Road, which is still there. The picture on the bottom shows the cleared property ready for building. It's also one of the very rare pictures of the east side of the stone church prior to construction of the addition. An interesting note from the archives relating to the addition. The master plan for the property was to eventually tear down the old stone sanctuary and replace it with a building in the same character as the contemporary prairie-style addition. This is the same picture as on the bottom of the last slide, but enlarged so it's a little bit easier to see, since it is a rare view of the church prior to the addition. Renovations were also made on the stone church, which included replacing the old crumbling leaded glass of the rose window with the slab glass version we have now. That occurred in 1965. You'll notice in these pictures from a newspaper article, this is Jane Anderson actually changing out one of the centers in the rose window, but if you look very closely, it's not the slab glass that we know there today that was installed in 1965. It's actually a stained glass motif that matched the windows in the side windows of the sanctuary. That leaded glass was becoming crumbling and difficult to maintain, which necessitated the change to the slab glass version. One of the church history books explains a little bit more about that process. But Jane Anderson has started a program of making different centers for the rose window that went along with different events of the church year, for special occasions, weddings, funerals, and other events. These articles from the News Gazette highlighted her efforts. We still enjoy those centers today, and over the years, new ones have been created. In the picture on the left, you can see the crane that was used to bring in many of the construction materials for the new RE wing. The picture on the right shows the excavation and the basement installed, ready for the next floor to be added. Some additional pictures highlight the panelized type of construction that kept the construction costs at a more manageable level. Upon its completion, there was mention of the newly completed church in both the Urbana Courier and the Champaign-based News Gazette. The articles highlighted the sunken porch around the basement of the new wing, which was not the gradual earthen berm that we know today, but it was actually a totally vertical concrete block wall that afforded an outdoor play area for the children and gathering space for adults. A rare aerial view of our property from that time shows some houses immediately behind our property, and the current playground was used as a parking lot. In this completion photo, note the concrete block wall that defined the open basement concept around the RE wing, and especially note the open balcony surrounding the east part of the building. A door opened onto the balcony at the northeast corner of what is now our Fellowship Hall. The space that comprises our current Fellowship Hall was actually divided into two distinct and equally sized spaces. A gathering area on the west end toward the sanctuary, which was used as our fellowship space, and on the east end was the children's chapel. The main kitchen for the church was in the older building's basement, what is now the YRUU room, and the space that is now our kitchen was classroom space. In 1968, Jack Taylor accepted a call to a church in San Francisco. Both Taylor and the congregation survived the building program and the turbulent 60s. When Renford Gaines accepted the call to ministry in 1968, he became the only black minister in the denomination called to a full-time parish ministry by a predominantly white church. Consciousness of a worsening racial climate in the country was high among white liberals, and the CU congregation was anxious to take a step that might improve matters in this community. Gaines was a man of considerable personal magnetism. His interest and skill in counseling were heavily utilized. He ran sensitivity groups, held seminars on death and drugs, and held intergenerational workshops. He planned a number of experimental worship services using dancers and musicians, which many people remember as a high point in their worship experience. Gaines was in Chicago when police shot their way into a Black Panther meeting and killed all but one person present. He'd already been passionate about the racial issue, but this flamed his sermons even more. Even though he was counseled by black members of our congregation to tone down the theme of white liberal guilt. Attendance declined, as did financial support. In the spring of 1970, he shifted much of his attention to the Afro-American Studies program. He also shifted attention to campus and to Channing Murray during the period of campus riots. Many late nights he could be found on the steps of Channing Murray, keeping watch over the building during threatened firebombings of campus buildings. Channing Murray served meals and folk singers for the benefits of National Guardsmen who enforced the curfew around the Foundation building. Later that spring, Renford Gaines accepted a call to the Arlington Street Church in Boston. Ed Harris came to us in December of 1970. The 60s turbulence left some lingering rifts and unfortunate estrangements within the congregation. Under Harris's leadership, deep divisions began to heal, and the church began to come back together. He preached life-centered sermons concerned with the vital problems people have in their homes, in personal relations, and as citizens. At the same time, he had an engaging lightness of touch and a wonderful sense of humor. Adults and children alike remember his original and enchanting Christmas stories. Twice during his tenure he left, once as a minister on loan and once on sabbatical. Harris was active not only in church issues, but in numerous community and denominational affairs. It's been conjectured that a period of burnout from his energy expenditure led to a stunned congregation when he tendered his resignation in the fall of 1993. The unpredicted departure of Ed Harris was eased by this interim minister, Virginia Knowles. She helped us evaluate our strengths and weaknesses and to articulate hopes for the future and develop a timeline. Her previous work experience in the CIA brought sermons that were global in nature. She helped reactivate our interest in social concerns and outreach, an activity that had been dormant for a period following the upheaval of the 60s and 70s. In the picture on the right, You can see a color picture of the old Wicks organ in the background during its last few years before being removed. The next minister, Will Saunders, arrived in April of 1985, and he left in June of 95. There were significant accomplishments during his tenure. He emphasized the need of the minister to serve as the spiritual leader of the congregation and for the church members to attend to church matters. One pressing church matter that occurred during his tenure was the issue of the organ. That will be highlighted in the next slide. Other activities of the time was a renovation of the sanctuary, the finances were stabilized, the congregation became more vocationally diversified, meaning less university-based, and the music programming was extraordinary. The mood of his ministry became more introspective, and the time came when he felt he needed a fresh start and challenge, as did the congregation. From some of our early slides about the history of the Unitarian Church, you remember that the Unitarian Church building was constructed in 1908. Students at the Channing Murray Foundation led the fundraising for the Kilgan tracker organ that had been installed there and first played on March 3, 1912. The Wicks electric organ at the Green Street Church had become impossible to repair, not being nearly as fine of an instrument. After more than 3 years of study and a very emotional debate, in 1991, the Kilgan organ at the Channing Murray location was moved, rebuilt, and reinstalled at the Green Street Church. About the same time, the whole question of Channing Murray's relationship to Green Street had been festering. There were many who thought the lack of a student-centered program was a problem. The time pressures on staff to maintain 2 programs and the financial pressures to maintain 2 buildings had taken a strong toll and reached a point of near crisis. The organ controversy didn't help. After much soul-searching, it was decided that both groups should go their separate ways. Channing Murray is considered an affiliate of the UUA. That relationship was highlighted in one of the earlier slides of the program. More recently, relations between the two have improved, and there are efforts to cooperate more on a variety of fronts. Reverend Saunders left in 1995 after causing some amount of trauma due to inappropriate behavior on his part. The church had become absorbed with the issues, and a time of healing was necessary while the new minister was sought. Bruce Johnson was the interim minister as the guide for this time frame. Members within the church had responded to the call of the UUA to implement the Welcoming Congregation curriculum to study issues surrounding lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons, and to affirm that the church be a welcoming space for them. The McKinley Presbyterian Church on campus was the local church that had really reached out to LGBT persons, and the UU Church didn't really have any specific ministry or approach to working with the LGBT folks. The UUA found that some UU churches had really not been welcoming to gays and lesbians, thus the need for the Welcoming Congregation program. The search committee called Axel and Elaine Gehrman to serve as co-ministers in 1996. They brought 2-year-old Noah and 5-month-old Sophia to make Urbana their home. They moved here from a co-ministry in Watertown, New York, where they had served for 5 years. They shared a salary and also the pulpit every other Sunday that they preached. They also shared child care duties for their own family, and for them a co-ministry was ideal for that time of their lives together. Following a period of growth with their very successful ministry, the church moved to 2 services. Other growth included the expansion of our RE program, with the RE director being increased from 20 to 32 hours per week. In addition to what was already mentioned, with the RE involvement increasing, we did ask the co-op nursery who rented our space during the week to leave, so we could fully occupy our space. The welcoming congregation process continued with a vote in favor in 1999. In 2001, we sponsored a combined capital campaign to raise funds for improvement of our facility. The campaign allowed us to make many upgrades to our old facility: a new kitchen and fellowship hall, better bathrooms that met ADA requirements, and some enhancements to the old building as well. In 2001, Elaine chose to leave co-ministry to pursue a law degree. Axel became our full-time minister, and a long-range planning process was begun. Within the UUA, it is up to a local congregation to ordain a minister, following their requisite education, internships, and other various hoops that they must jump through before becoming a full-fledged minister. Since 1957, we have ordained 3 ministers. Renford Gaines in 1968 in a joint installation and ordination ceremony. After us, he served 6 years at the Arlington Street Church. Still in fellowship since his ordination, he is now a professor emeritus from the Morehouse School of Medicine and an associate rector at St. Paul's Episcopal in Atlanta. Now, this was from a 2001 document that I had found on the internet. David Robbins was ordained in 1978. David had been a church member here, served his internship under Ed Harris, and served 22 years as a minister at the Bloomington Normal UU Church. And in the spring of 2009, at the time of the writing of this first program, he was called to the Peterborough, New Hampshire Unitarian Universalist Church. Matt Tittle was ordained in 2004. He was a member here with his wife Gail and 2 sons when he felt the call to ministry. After seminary, his first congregation was the Bay Area UU Church in Houston, Texas. We continue to make history in everything we do, and much has occurred since the preparation of this program in 2009, which was delivered with a live presentation, and the audio recorded of the slides in 2016, partly to serve as historical backdrop for our ministerial search process following the departure of the Reverend Axel Gehrman. We had 19 years with the Gehrmans and hated to see them leave, but we see it as a wonderful opportunity for us to shift gears, to take stock of where we are now, and to determine our future experiences together.